In Chapter 3, Robbins is telling us about several really important considerations for web design and development. And these have to do with how good of an experience are you providing for the audience. Now, we've all seen web pages that are ugly. We've opened web pages and apps on our phone where maybe the text was so small we couldn't read it, or the menus were messed up because it was on a phone. So we're talking about things like that. Robbins covers 6 distinct topics in this chapter, and I'm going to go over each of these briefly, just trying to give you a little more of an idea of why these things are so important. I advise you to read the chapter for more details and resources. So the first of these is device and screen sizes, and as you know, devices that we use to access digital media come in a lot of different sizes, from really giant desktop monitors all the way down to our phones. And, phones used to be even smaller than they are now. So how do you design a page or a rectangle and images and videos so that they can gracefully fit inside any of these and they don't get too big on the biggest screens and look ridiculous? One thing to keep in mind is every device has measurements in pixels. So it's got a width that can be measured in pixels, and it's got a height that can be measured in pixels. Using a pixel measurement is how we can use CSS to adjust our styles to adapt for different devices. It's important to understand that the web runs on standards. The reason that we can see all the web things on all the devices is because standards are keeping things on an even keel. And when you're designing, when you're authoring for the web, you need to pay attention to the current standards, and these are determined by the World Wide Web Consortium, known as the W3C. And so when you need to figure out, well, is your information about a certain style or a certain markup or a tag or a selector, is it out of date? Is it no longer done that way? You can always go to the W3C and look it up and find out what is the current best practice. And this is how responsible web designers and developers operate. Progressive enhancement is the current best practice for making sure that all your users can get the content from your site or your app that you're intending to provide. And it means that you start with a baseline. You start with standards compliant HTML that will show up and be readable on even the oldest, lowest device and the oldest browser that's currently being used. And then little by little, you add more styles, more functionality, but you do it in such a way that the extras will not break the experience for the people with the older device or the slower connection and so forth. So again, a competent professional web designer or developer will ensure that she or he uses progressive enhancement and not the old style, which is called graceful degradation. And that is a practice that competent professionals don't follow anymore. I'm going to give you a separate video about responsive design, showing you how to add some of the standard responsive code to your own pages and sites. But to begin with, to give you an idea, it's connected to what we've been talking about. It provides a good experience for people regardless of what kind of device they're using, and particularly what size of device they're using. It adapts itself. The way the page looks, the size of the type will adapt to the device on which it's being viewed. And in the end, this makes the experience better for all the people who are having it. Later in this course, we'll start using Bootstrap, which is a responsive framework, and you'll learn how to make your sites and apps more responsive using this tool. To see some great examples of responsive design on real current websites, go to the Media Queries site. Making our sites and apps accessible is probably a lot more important than you realize, because people with all kinds of different abilities are using the internet for their jobs, for education, to look up health information and other important stuff. So people with visual impairment, blind people, use the internet, use the web, and use apps. People with mobility impairment who cannot use a mouse, but they can still navigate a keyboard, sometimes using a pencil to push keys. People who can't hear or who have limited hearing, and sometimes people with various kinds of cognitive impairment. So how can we make our pages, our sites, and our apps more accessible? There are guidelines, there are standards that we can follow. Once again, we look to the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, for the guidelines and different specifications to help us make our pages accessible. And one of the really important things about accessibility that Robbins points out is that if you work for any kind of government organization and you're working on their apps and websites, you must meet certain accessibility requirements. You need to comply with certain guidelines, or else your organization gets into trouble, because they're required to make their sites accessible to people with different disabilities. Last but not least, Robin discusses site performance. And again, this is something that professionals are always very concerned about. You don't want any of your images to have a larger file size than is necessary, because if you do, then you're making people download stuff they don't really need. They are waiting longer, they're consuming more data, and you're not doing a good service for them. Similarly, you don't want to have too many calls to the server. So you remember request and response from week 1. And so every time an image loads, every time a JavaScript file loads, every time a CSS file loads, that is another call to the server, and it's time, right? It's like talk to the server, server responds. Request to the server, server responds. So good developers try to keep those requests to a minimum. They try to keep file sizes to a minimum. We've talked about keeping font sizes low. You don't want to go into that red zone on the Google Fonts meter, right? So optimizing your site for the best performance means looking at file sizes and streamlining it as much as you can. So chapter 3 is a pretty short chapter, but it's got really important concepts in it. If you stick with web development, you're going to find you spend more and more time thinking with these concepts and using these concepts to improve your work.